Thanks very much, Peter. I've been here yesterday and today. I'm sort of very, in a sense, humbled by all the individual presentations that people have given and hearing people's lived experience of all the interventions, we're calling them, all the work that's being done by small organisations, medium-sized organisations, trying in a sense to improve well-being, to make everyone happier, to make people feel better. And it's really just the scale of it is really huge. Just here for these last 2 days, so many people have talked about individual things. So I've got a slightly different view of this. I'm looking at it from the other end of the telescope. Rather than looking at an individual intervention, I'm trying to tell you about churches as a sector, and the well-being benefit that churches provide to the UK, rather than one individual project. So it's sort of macro rather than micro. And what I'm going to tell you about is a little bit about what is well-being. We've heard everybody's been talking about well-being, but it probably means slightly different things to different people. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the church sector. It's a big sector, lots of buildings, not all of them heritage buildings, but the majority of them heritage buildings. Then I'm going to talk to you about a report that we did a few years ago called The House of Good. And then I'm going to talk to you at the end just about some other little bits of research that we're doing. And I'm Eddie Tulasiewicz. I'm the head of policy and public affairs for the National Churches Trust. We are a UK-wide charity, been going in one form or another about 200 years. We support church buildings. We come from a heritage background, but they don't have to be listed buildings. We support church buildings that are open for worship, any denomination throughout the UK. We're primarily a funder. We give grants for fixing things or putting in loos, basically to keep those buildings open. So UK churches and well-being. Well-being. It's why are we interested in well-being as an organisation, or more generally? Well, what we wanted to do was to tell the people who, the Treasury, government, other funders, that church buildings are important, and that they've got a real financial contribution to the well-being of this country, the United Kingdom. In a sense, what is the return on investment that government or another funder would have by putting in £1 worth of grant? What are they going to get back for that? What's society going to get back for that? So we're interested in well-being because well-being sometimes it's the same thing as happiness, or happiness is well-being, or happiness is part of well-being. Yesterday was International Happiness Day, you may have noticed. That's a day that's run by the United Nations. It's a worldwide thing. And there are lots of sort of economists and statisticians and data gatherers who try and work out how happy people are. And it links into sort of the well-being economy, people trying to look at the world in a way that isn't GDP, gross domestic product, which is gross domestic product is just how much money is produced by building things or making things. You can also measure people's well-being, and that's another way of looking at the world, really. Well-being, we think that church buildings have, and as we've heard the last 2 days, all of heritage has got a really important role to play in increasing well-being. And if you're a policymaker, if you're a funder, you may have to, you may think, why do you choose one thing rather than another? Why should the government fund this rather than that? Policy A may have a bigger impact on one objective, maybe getting people into work. Policy B may have another objective. It might make people healthier. There's a guy called Professor Lord Richard Layard, who's at the London School of Economics. He's the sort of well-being guru, and he says that governments should determine where they put their money by the well-being of people. So it's putting well-being at the centre of sort of economic decision-making. If you're interested, there's an organisation at Oxford University called the Wellbeing Research Centre. Look them up online. They do a lot of research into well-being and the economics of well-being. Oxford University, Do look them up, the Wellbeing Research Centre. So that's sort of, and just in terms of why it's important, I've got a quote here. There may be a change of government, there may not be, but Keir Starmer recently said, as a quote, "With every pound spent on your behalf," that's the taxpayers, "we would expect the Treasury to weigh not just its effect on national income, but also its effect on well-being." So, it's really important in terms of policy making at a national level. What about well-being economics? Okay, because economics is part of well-being. So we, as an organisation, National Churches Trust, want to build the evidence case for church buildings. It's the same for heritage more broadly. We need to build that evidence case. So why should they be funded? Why should Historic England get any money? Why should the lottery fund heritage? What's the point of it? It really comes down to choosing those policies which might produce the most well-being for every pound spent. Okay, maybe not all the time the greatest amount of well-being from every pound spent, but it's important. If you've got a limited amount of money, you want to put that money where it's going to have the greatest effect. And we've heard a lot about health economics, been very important for health economics. So sometimes treatments are accepted by the NHS, sometimes they're not. Cancer drugs, expensive treatments. And why? Because they don't have enough long-term well-being effect. A cancer treatment might only keep someone alive for 3 months, and it's really expensive. So instead of putting the money into that, they'll put it into something that might help people for 3 years. So there's more sort of, those people are going to die, but more people are going to live by funding the other thing. And the important body in all sorts of government funding is the Treasury, Jeremy Hunt and the Chancellor, and they have in their funding criteria, which is called the Green Book, the Treasury Green Book, social well-being is one of the goals, and there's a measure that you can measure well-being as a monetary equivalent, which is called, strangely enough, it's called a Wellbe. And that measures the sort of well-being benefit, and it's taken partly from health economics, but there is something out there called a Wellbe, and you can measure things by Wellbes. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to well-being, why it's important, and well-being economics. I'm not an economist, so I'm trying to keep this relatively simple so I can understand it. There's a lot more detail to all this, of course. Briefly, churches in the UK. I don't know, how many of you know about the church sector. Okay, there's a bit of a spin here. They're impressive, exciting, and surprising places. There are about 38,500 churches in the UK that are open for worship, not every day, but on a regular basis. And 20,000 of those are listed. So that's heritage. 20,000, over half of all churches are heritage buildings. They could be 1,000 years old. They could be Victorian. They could even be 20th century. They're listed buildings. Those 20,000, nearly half of those are grade 1. So it's really important heritage. So as well as their heritage, they're important for all the community stuff that happens. We've heard a lot about community hubs. A lot of churches are community hubs as well. They do huge amounts of things, from food banks. I've got a whole list of them here. Activities for the elderly, dementia cafes, sports activities, holiday clubs, drug alcohol support, lunch clubs, blah, blah, blah. Lots of things happen in church buildings that are of benefit to the community. They also have a very large number of volunteers, and volunteers, by volunteering, that's a really good way of increasing somebody's well-being, especially if they're doing it in a group of people. They're also used for worship. I suppose we could call churches Heritage Plus. Okay, and of course there are buildings of other faiths as well that do similar things, mosques, gurdwaras, temples, and so on. Churches aren't the only religious buildings around. But as a lot of heritage, churches are under threat. There's a huge repair bill. Church of England estimates it's got a backlog of £1 billion. In Wales, a quarter of all churches and chapels have closed in Wales. In Scotland, 40% are at risk. And some of that's to do with changing societal trends. Some of it's just simply to do with the fact that there isn't enough money to keep the buildings going. These are expensive buildings to run. If you want to fix a roof on a medieval church, it's going to cost you, £500,000. And if it's a small church in a, rural area, it's very difficult to get the money, and the funding from government and heritage bodies, it's less than it used to be. So churches are under threat. So that's why we wanted to show the well-being value of churches to try and get more money for them. I'm not going to show you a video. You can go to our website and find things to watch there. Very briefly, people still think churches are a good thing. All right, the last census, only 46% of people identified as being Christian, 37% said they had no religion. But our latest opinion poll, which we did in December last year, 68% of adults agree that they're an important part of heritage. Okay, 66% think they're important for society, and more than half of all adults did visit a church building last year, 54%, and 17% went as a tourist or visitor. So people do use those buildings. In terms of community use, which is really what I'm talking about, well-being, these are some of the things that people say they do when they visit a church. The top 5 things: they go to a concert or a musical event. A lot of music happens in churches. They've gone to a food bank. They visited a craft fair. They've gone to a nursery. They've been to a warm space. Those are the 5 top communities things that people have done. Okay, so now we're going to get on to the slightly more complicated, or for me anyway, issue of well-being, how you measure it, because we're going to get into some numbers here. It's the community use of church buildings that we looked at to look at their contribution to well-being in a report that we did called The House of Good. If you Google The House of Good with National Churches Trust in the same search term, you'll find it. All the reports are there, all the evidence is there, lots of stuff that I haven't got time to talk about. Basically, we look at the sort of well-being value, what's called the non-market value. Everything has a market value. A church has a market value because it might employ somebody. It pays, to have something fixed. So that's the market value. The non-market value is the well-being that happens because of volunteering, by people taking advantage of, food banks, taking part in some heritage event, even just visiting the heritage. The last paragraph here is the sort of technical one. So our economists converted the market value of well-being into a monetary value, blah, blah, blah. It's accepted by the Treasury. And that is right. When we first did this report, it was valued, each well-be had a value of £2,500, okay? £2,500. And then it's a question of multiplying. Not everything that you do in a church has a well-being value of £2,500. It could be slightly less, it could be slightly more, and then you multiply it. So if you've got 100 people, let's imagine going to a food bank, and the value was £2,500 for that activity per year by the person benefiting from it. You've got to multiply 1,000 by you've got to multiply 100 by 2,500, and you end up at 25,000 or 200, whatever the figure is. You multiply two numbers together and you come up with a bigger figure. So 3 things that we looked at, and this is applicable to other heritage organisations. The value of volunteers. There's a well-being value of volunteering. Taking part, so we estimated how many volunteers there were each year in churches. We worked it out. We had a couple of big data surveys. About 1.3 million people volunteer each year in churches. So we multiplied one figure by another. We came up with a figure. The benefit of volunteering is £165 million a year. Okay, so that was value number 1. Then we looked at the community support. That's the things I was talking about, like food banks. We looked at 4 things in particular: food banks, counselling and mental health, youth groups, drug and alcohol support. We saw yesterday that there's that church in Manchester that's now a redundant church. Your church, was it? 1 minute, okay. I'll get really quickly. I'm done all the figures. So okay. So the second value was the community support. This was a huge figure. Came out at £8.3 billion of value. Okay. The third one is attending church. It's not a religious value. That's the fact that you're together with other people in a building. It can happen in other heritage buildings. That's 1.4 billion quid a year, okay? After we did this, that figure that I spoke of £2,500 per Wellbeing was increased by the Treasury to about £13,000 a Wellbeing. So all our figures that I've mentioned here went up fivefold. So increase all that value by fivefold, and you come up with a figure, including some market value, of £55 billion a year. The value of church buildings to the UK. Okay, so very quickly then, I won't give you the table. What we're doing now is we're producing a local calculator, which will allow every church to put in its own numbers of people doing this, that, and the other, and we'll come up with a figure at the end. So your church might be what we've done, some pilots. It varies between, like, my church is worth 200,000 up to 3.5 million. So it'll allow a church to value its own benefit, which could be of use in fundraising with a local council, even if the diocese wants to close it down. So we're doing that. We're going to be releasing that later this year. We're also doing some work on loneliness, looking at how churches and what happens in churches can help combat loneliness. The figures are very elusive because it's very hard to show a causality between attending a lunch club or going along to something. Have you really, is it attending that's increased your well-being or not? Hard to know, but we are looking at that area, and we're going to be producing a report in that later this year. We've also somehow managed to find a figure that I'm wrapping up now that shows the well-being value that you get from visiting a historic church, okay? And that comes out, we've worked that out, that's about £850 a year per person who visits a historic church. If there are around 12 million people who visit churches each year as visitors, the value to the UK of people visiting historic churches, there's some caveats to this, is probably around £10 billion a year. So what I'm trying to say here is we've looked at the sort of the big picture here, because we want to make a case to show people that these buildings are worth putting money into to keep them open because of all the well-being that happens in them. Yes, they've got heritage value as well. They might have value because they're religious buildings, but they have a huge well-being value. And I would suggest that lots of other buildings, activities that go on have, if we were able to gross up all the heritage activity that happens in the UK and work out the well-being value, enormous.
Thank you, Eddie.
Well done.